Okay, Dr. Campbell, can you spell your name for the record, your first and last name?
First name is Vera, Vera. Last name Campbell, Campbell.
And can you state your position and title?
Yes, I am the Assistant Dean for Assessment within the School of Pharmacy. I'm also an Assistant Professor in the Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences, and I have a background in drug abuse research.
It's good to have you, Dr. Campbell. Okay, my first question. Heroin was first synthesized in 1874. Now, that's a long time ago, but Bayer Pharmaceuticals, a large pharmaceutical company, was the first to market it under the trademark heroin as a cough suppressant and as a non-addictive morphine substitute. What was the state of the pharmaceutical industry in those times? And fast forward to today, what major regulations and advancement have taken place to avoid that sort of misclassification?
And what you have to realize is back in the 1800s, we were just kind of switching from the time when you had apothecaries or what was known as pharmacies back then that were still using remedies as opposed to what we have now, which we're more technologically advanced. You have companies that are able to do research and actually do studies that will test for the abuse liability of drugs that which they know in structure are similar to like an opiate. They will actually do tests to determine whether or not there is abuse liability for those drugs. Whereas in the 1800s, it was just starting to get into that research technology age. And so basically the patient was the research subject. And so while they knew that there were people that took drugs that were similar to opium that were addicted, they really didn't understand the abuse liability until you were treating a patient and that patient was craving and seeking the drug.
Speaking of risk liability, we know heroin can be sniffed, smoked, or injected. Which form possesses the most, or the greatest rather, risk of lethal overdose?
It's the intravenous method of injection. And the reason being is that when it's in the blood, it quickly goes to the brain and it can work on the receptors that are in the brain that would cause respiratory depression.
Okay.
Whereas when someone is sniffing it, it actually has to be absorbed through the nasal mucosa, then get into the blood and produce an effect. So rapid onset of effect via the IV use. And it's also the route of administration that most people, if you are IV using it, you will get the feeling of the flush and high more quickly. And that's why people will abuse IV more so than they would if they were taking it orally or sniffing it.
Is there a preferred form of intake by heroin users?
Mostly IV because if you're thinking about cost, you don't need as much to get the high if you use it intravenously versus if someone were to sniff it, you're going to need a greater dose to get the same quote unquote high feeling.
And a follow-up to that question do heroin users more so stick to the same method over their lifetime of using heroin?
Yes. Basically most heroin users are going to use the method or that is going to get them the fastest high and is going to keep them high the longest, and that will be the intravenous method.
Okay. Are there any numbers to show that there is a preferred age or gender or demographic for heroin users?
In the past, it was typically used by inner city men. But now you kind of have seen a switch to Caucasian female, and I believe that it kind of goes right along with who's using prescription drugs. And if you aren't able to get prescription drugs because of regulations and maybe you have been, potentially the pharmacy has flagged you and now you can't get drugs because you've been doctor hopping, then the other way that you're going to get, your IV, or not your, the other way that you're going to get analgesia or euphoria is from using heroin
Okay.
and getting it illegally.
What are the chances of surviving a heroin overdose?
Well, now you have IV medications such as naloxone that can quickly basically rescue a person that has overdosed. It's much greater than in the past. And, some states have new regulations. I believe it's the state of New Jersey has the Overdose Prevention Act, in which, say you have a family member that is addicted to heroin, they will actually allow a pharmacist to dispense naloxone, and they're able to have that naloxone on them in case their family member overdoses. So there are certain states like Massachusetts, and they've recently documented that they believe about 2,000 people have been saved from death via overdose because of this naloxone that has been actually um, dispensed to family members or friends of a heroin addict.
You mentioned the naloxone.
Can you pause for a second? Great job. Just hold on one second, okay?
Okay.
Also, fast forward to the Hampton Roads and why we're seeing a surge, okay?
Okay.
Okay, go. Thank you.
Okay. So we're here in the Hampton Roads community. Why are we seeing a surge among heroin use in this community?
Okay. In Hampton Roads, we've seen an increase in death due to heroin use. And I believe it's because they're not just using heroin. It's a combination of heroin and fentanyl. Fentanyl is also an opioid, and with fentanyl, I'm distracted by the,
Sorry,
That's okay.
stand by. We're gonna close the door.
Yeah. And you could just start from your question.
okay.
Yeah. You want me to repeat the question? Okay.
Start from the question.
Okay. So we're here in the Hampton Roads community. Why is there a surge among the use of heroin users in the Hampton Roads community?
Well, see, that's.
Why do we see a surge?
It's not really, and I'll
Well,
tell you, it's
explain
not
that.
really a surge in heroin use, more so than they're seeing a higher death rate.
So explain that to me.
So
Yeah.
what that means is that, the users now, there's kind of a mix of heroin and fentanyl. Fentanyl is an opiate, and what fentanyl is similar to morphine, heroin. It's a synthetic compound that's used usually post-operatively or used, and when someone is getting a surgery, they'll put it intravenously or maybe even in an epidural. It's very potent. It's 100 times more potent than morphine. And so users now are actually injecting a combination of heroin and fentanyl. And what typically happens when something, and it's not really new, but it's kind of new to this area, when something new comes around, until they realize how potent it is, you'll have a higher incidence of overdoses, and then people will realize that, hey, this is very potent and they need to use less of the drug, and then you'll see it go back down a little bit.
My thinking is this is a controlled substance, fentanyl. How are users on the streets getting access to that kind of controlled substance?
It's coming illegally. People are, stealing it. You also have those
From hospitals?
individuals. They could be stealing it from hospitals, but you have individuals that can synthesize drugs nowadays. So, you can get it in multiple ways.
In the homes, they can synthesize it.
Well,
And it's,
I would say that you probably more so have someone with labs out there that may be synthesizing fentanyl.
okay. In terms of government intervention, I guess, the U.S. is spending more than $50 billion annually on controlling these kinds of drug activity or drug war, as they say. Does any of that money go to pharmaceutical companies?
For a drug well, repeat that question again.
So the U.S. government is spending about $50 billion annually in what they call this drug war. And my question is any of that money going to pharmaceutical companies to help prevent drug overdoses or drug crimes, creating medicine and prescriptions to deal with overdoses?
Okay, I would say more that the money may be going to, and I don't know for sure, but if any of the money is funneling back, it's probably going through the way of research, the National Institutes of Health, potentially through the Food and Drug Administration to help to regulate the companies. But the companies themselves, because they usually have their own in-house research and development team, they typically, do their own research. And I doubt if they would receive federal funds and to help with their research. It's more or less regulations that are coming from the federal government to the companies, as opposed to the companies saying, this is how you prevent overdose or educating the public. So it's usually coming from that way in instead of from the company out, because the company is in business, to make the dollar more so than to educate the public. So typically the regulations come in and say, okay, if you have a drug that has abuse potential, then you have to say, let the public know that there is abuse liability when you use this particular drug. And it's usually regulations that are coming in. And so the companies have to let you know about their medications, about their drugs, especially if they are an opioid or an opiate.
Okay. My final question, what is one thing you would like to inform our audience, the Hampton Roads community, as well as Hampton University students, about heroin and drug use in general?
Well, especially for heroin, there's so much more than, just the risk of overdose when you're talking about the use of IV drugs. You have the potential to get any type of blood-borne disease right along with using the heroin. And with our, in our area, especially since we're seeing the rise of, deaths, there potentially probably is a rise in use of heroin. And so just, be careful, don't reuse needles, and seek help. Because if you are addicted to heroin, typically you're going to end up overdosing at some point. It's not one of those drugs that are abused that doesn't have that, high death rate associated with it.
Okay, good job.
Thank you.
Yeah.